Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining the Sentencing Project and the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition webinar on felony disenfranchisement and the midterm elections. My name is Morgan McLeod, and I'm the Communications Manager at the Sentencing Project. Today, you will hear from Marc, Executive Director at the Sentencing Project, who will discuss our latest report on felony disenfranchisement reforms over the past 2 decades. Then we will hear from Desmond Meade, President of the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, who will discuss Florida's voter restoration amendment on the November ballot. Next, we will hear from Taina Vargas-Edmond, co-founder of Initiate Justice, who will discuss efforts to expand voting rights to people with felony convictions in California. And then finally, we will be joined by Shannon, assistant professor at the University of Georgia and co-author of the Sentencing Project's 2016 report, 6 Million Lost Voters, State-Level Estimates of Felony Disenfranchisement. She will discuss the research on collecting this data and highlight some of the challenges. There will be a Q&A after the presentation. You can submit your questions anytime during the presentation or during the Q&A using the panel on your GoToWebinar screen. If you look on the toolbar on the right, there's a section for you to submit your questions. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted online afterwards. So to start, I'm going to hand things off to our Executive Director, Marc. I'll have him share his screen so he can discuss our new felony disenfranchisement report.
Thank you very much, Morgan, and thanks to all of you for being here today. As the midterm elections are approaching in a few weeks, obviously there's a great deal of interest and excitement in the political world. Many people are expecting a particularly high turnout this year, but unfortunately we need to note that 6 million people will not be participating in the elections, not because they don't necessarily care about the outcome, but because they are prohibited from voting because of a felony conviction in the state in which they live. Felony convictions and disenfranchisement vary tremendously across the 50 states, and they're all state-based policies. In 48 states in the District of Columbia, individuals in prison serving time on a felony are not eligible to vote. In 34 of these states, people under probation and/or parole supervision are not eligible to vote. And in 12 of these states, a person can be disenfranchised even after completing sentences. The 4 most restrictive states, Florida, Iowa, Kentucky, Kentucky and Virginia, have a policy of lifetime disenfranchisement. The only way that rights can be restored in those states is through executive action, a pardon from the governor or a pardons board. Now, despite these, what I would consider disturbing statistics, we are very encouraged at the scale of reform, the pace of reform over the past 2 decades. As Morgan mentioned, we've released a new report this week from the Sentencing Project, authored by Morgan McLeod, that documents reforms that have taken place in 23 states over the past 20 years to disenfranchisement policies. Collectively, these reforms have resulted in extension of voting rights to 1.4 million people who had been previously denied the vote. These reforms are quite broad-ranging. In some states, there are notification requirements that have been added, essentially whereby correction systems, parole systems are obligated to notify individuals exiting from criminal justice supervision, essentially about when and how they can regain the right to vote, because there's tremendous misinformation about these policies, not only among individuals with felony convictions, but sometimes among election officials themselves. In other states, legislators have enacted a scaling back of the categories of disenfranchisement that are applicable in their state. So in terms of voting after supervision, the states of New Mexico, Texas, and Maryland are among those that have done away with that post-sentence disenfranchisement. In those states now, as soon as you complete your supervision, you regain your right to vote. Several states have extended voting rights to people on probation and/or parole supervision who previously did not have access to voting. This includes Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Maryland in those categories. We've also seen governors using their executive authority to extend voting rights to previously disenfranchised individuals. Earlier this year in New York State, Governor Cuomo, through executive authority, restored the right to vote to everyone currently under parole supervision in New York State, an estimated 35,000 people. So these people are still disenfranchised by law and will be until the law changes, but now the governor's re-enfranchised them, as pledged to do so moving forward for other individuals on parole. Virginia, as I mentioned, is one of the most restrictive states by its constitution, but prior to leaving office a couple of years ago, Governor Terry McAuliffe used his executive authority to restore the right to vote to 173,000 individuals who had completed their felony sentences. In these states, there's often been a good deal of activity by advocates on the ground to make sure that people know their rights have been restored, to encourage them to register, to encourage them to get out and vote. You'll soon hear on the webinar from our colleague Desmond Meade in Florida about the ballot initiative coming up in a few weeks there. Desmond will explain in detail, but let me just say if this ballot issue is successful, it would be by far the most major step in re-enfranchising more than 1 million people in that state. Florida's by far the leading state in terms of the numbers of people who've lost the right to vote. Let me just say in closing that if we want to keep perspective on this issue, if we look at where the United States stands internationally, as is true of our criminal justice policies broadly in mass incarceration, we are at an extreme compared to other industrialized nations, Western Europe, Canada. In many of those nations, no one is disenfranchised as a result of a felony conviction. Among the nations that do impose some type of disenfranchisement, it's almost always limited solely to the period of incarceration, not during probation or parole, and certainly not after completion of sentence. There are 2 states in the United States, Maine and Vermont, that have these policies where no one is disenfranchised. Individuals in prison are able to vote through an absentee ballot. It's been this way in those states for many, many years with absolutely no problems, and making the point, I think, that democracy can extend beyond the prison walls as well. So we're delighted to be here today with our colleagues. We're also very encouraged about the pace of reform over 20 years, and I think there's good reason to believe we'll see additional reforms coming up in the coming years. Thanks.
Thank you, Marc. And next up, we will hear from Desmond Meade, so he can tell us about this important Florida ballot initiative. Desmond?
Yes, thank you so much. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. First of all, I definitely want to, it's an honor to partner with the Sentencing Project and be on with the great Marc Maurer. We have totally enjoyed your support and partnership over the years. And I am, I'm happy to be on this webinar today because for so long, we've always talked about what was wrong, and a lot of our conversations have not been as had happy connotations to it. But for today, I can say that I am happy because we are 19 days away from striking a fatal blow to Jim Crow here in Florida. This is something that we have talked about for quite a number of years, and even at some point we didn't think that we would be here, but here we are, and I'm very excited about what we're poised to do on November 6th, but I'm even more excited about how we got here. And we've heard from Marc Maurer about the different policies throughout the states. I want to just touch for a second on the current policy in Florida to really give a little context as to why this ballot initiative that we embarked on was a necessity. The current policy that we have in place today requires that an individual waits either 5 or 7 years after they have completed all portions of their sentence before they're allowed to just apply. Now, once that individual applies after the 5 or 7 year wait, what we've seen, particularly among those who've been waiting 7 years, is that they have to wait an additional 10 plus years before they have an opportunity to have a hearing. Now, it's I think it's important to note that even waiting 17 years does not guarantee a person to have a hearing. And so someone could wait for that period of time and be denied an opportunity to appear before the governor and his cabinet. But for those that are lucky enough after waiting 17 plus years, when they walk in those doors, they have slim to none chance of getting their civil rights restored, and that the decision to restore rights has been a purely arbitrary decision, which means that the governor and his cabinet could deny for any reason or no reason at all. And this has been the subject of a recent court case in Walker v. Scott that is right now in the appellate courts. However, so this type of policies we knew was something that, well, first of all, we knew that much power to decide which American citizen get to vote and which don't get to vote should never be left in the hands of any politician, no matter what party they belong to, whether they're Democrat, Republican, or whatever, to just have that much power to control probably the most endearing sign of citizenship, which is voting. We knew that something had to be done, and we did that. We launched a citizens initiative from a purely grassroots perspective, and we were able to do amazing things. We were able to collect over 80,000 signatures to get before the Florida Supreme Court, and when we got there, the Florida Supreme Court ruled unanimously, which allowed us to continue collecting petitions. And last year, in a span of 5 months, we collected over 1 million petitions to get this particular referendum on the ballot. What this referendum does is provides a fast track. It provides a way for individuals who have completely served all portions of their sentence to earn the eligibility to vote again. This does not apply to individuals who were convicted of murder or individuals who were convicted of felony sexual offenses, but everyone else would have an opportunity to at least earn the eligibility to vote and participate in our democratic process. We are just the nature of this issue. When you talk about voting, when you talk about felony disenfranchisement, and you talk about the state of Florida, the nature of this says that this is a very controversial topic. It's a very controversial initiative. However, what we've seen on the ground is that there've been overwhelming support across the board from people from all walks of life, from all political parties, from all demographics that have overwhelmingly supported this particular initiative. One of the reasons I would like to really highlight is the fact that, number one, we recognize, while we do not minimize the disproportionate impact that it has on African American communities, we do recognize that felon disenfranchisement has become like a tumor and that have been left unchecked, and as a result have grown and impacted not just African Americans, but Latino Americans and white Americans as well, to the point where African Americans now only account for a third of the people in Florida who cannot vote. And because of that, we were able to organize people who are directly impacted from all walks of life. And so we have folks who are conservative, we have folks who are progressive, we have folks who don't care either way, who have lost their civil rights and have just desire to be an American citizen again. And because we were able to organize them and their family members, we have created a coalition of people who have been able to come together along the lines of humanity, which has allowed us to transcend partisan politics and also transcend racial anxieties into a space that I believe is so beautiful, that has caused us to poll at over 70% with 3 weeks leading into the election. And so we're very hopeful. We've gotten some very key endorsements that have really, I think, illustrated the wide support, bipartisan support. We've gotten support from the Christian Coalition. We've gotten support from the Florida Conference of Catholic Bishops. We've gotten support from the Coke Industry Network, as well as the ACLU, as well as organizations like ASJ and others. And so we're very hopeful that with this bipartisan support from across the boards, with the effort that's going on the grassroots, that we'll be able to be victorious on November 6th and create a more inclusive democracy in the state of Florida. I want to end my session with this, and I think it's very important. We believe that creating a more inclusive democracy will create a more vibrant democracy, and a more vibrant democracy is good for everyone. And as a result, we know that we don't care how, and we believe that deciding to support an initiative such as ours should never be based on how we think someone may vote or may not vote. So we don't care how a person would vote. What we care about is that when the debt is paid, it's paid, and that every American citizen should have the ability to have their voice heard or to vote. As such, we would say with boldness that we are fighting just as hard for that person who wished he could have voted for Donald Trump as that person who wanted to vote for President Barack Obama, because we believe that all American citizens should have as much access to the voting booth as possible. Thank you once again, Citizen Project, for inviting me and partnering with the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition and our efforts here in Florida, and appreciate the opportunity to be on this webinar.
Thank you so much, Desmond. Now we will hear from another advocate working on expanding voting rights, Taina Vargas-Edmond from Initiate Justice. You can share your screen.
Hi, so my name is Taina with Initiate Justice, and Initiate Justice is a policy-driven organization built by and for people directly impacted by mass incarceration in California. So essentially what we do is work to build the political power of people who are in prison, formerly incarcerated people, and their loved ones. And in order to do that, it was really important for us to begin working on campaigns to work to restore voting rights to folks impacted by incarceration. So I'll start with just a bit of an overview in terms of what existing laws are in California around felony disenfranchisement, and then I'll move into the work that Initiate Justice has done and what we are planning on doing in the future. So right now in California, folks cannot vote if they're currently incarcerated in a California state prison or if they are on state parole. So we are fairly more advanced than a lot of other states, certainly. Florida, for example, folks in county jails can vote and folks on county probation can vote. However, there are approximately 162,000 California citizens who cannot vote because they're in state prison or on state parole. So last year, we sought to fix this problem by circulating a petition that would have introduced an initiative on this year's ballot to restore voting rights to all folks in prison and on parole. Us being like such a new organization, we didn't get the funding that we needed. However, we did manage to recruit 500 volunteers across the state and collect more than 25,000 signatures. And in doing that effort, we were able to get the attention of the California State Legislature and the governor, and also have been, building the narrative and changing the conversation around felony disenfranchisement in California. So what we are planning on working on this year is both a legislative bill and a campaign around narrative change. So in terms of the bill, we have a state assembly member who is introducing a bill package this year, which would amend the California state constitution and the elections code to put something on the ballot in 2020 to restore voting rights for formerly incarcerated people on parole. So that wouldn't be the full 162,000 people we were aiming for. It'll be closer to 40 or 50,000 people, but it would be a huge step in the right direction. So that bill, because it's changing the state constitution, requires a 2/3 majority to pass, and will be introduced in January of 2019. So we'll be working on that, assuming that it gets the 2/3 majority that it needs and it passes. Then in 2020, the voters will still have to vote on that initiative on the ballot. So it's really hard to change here in California. And one of the reasons that we decided to accept the amended legislative bills where it would only restore voting rights for folks on parole was because of some polling that we conducted when we were doing the original initiative that would have restored voting rights to all. And unfortunately, right now, it's not polling very well in California in terms of restoring voting rights to folks who are currently in California state prisons. So as a strategic step, we decided to go ahead and move forward with folks who are on parole, restore their voting rights, work on changing the narrative, and building a culture in California where folks understand that no one should ever lose their voting rights because of a felony conviction, and then move forward. And then in terms of the narrative change, I'll talk about that a little bit as well. We are in the process of writing a report where we are going to be essentially creating like a snapshot of how the electorate in California would be different if we restored voting rights to the 160,000 people in prison and on parole. So we conducted a survey of currently incarcerated people and people on parole who cannot vote at the moment, asking essentially what types of things they'd be interested in voting for if they could. What are their policy priorities? What qualities do they look for in a candidate? How likely they would even be to vote? And then also determining some demographic information as well, so that we could determine, how many folks of different races would be more inclined to vote, even understanding like which people from which political parties would be more inclined to vote if their voting rights were restored. And part of the reason that we're doing that was when we were working on trying to get our initiative on the ballot, there's this narrative that comes up that says, well, people inside, people in prison, like shouldn't be able to vote. One, because they lost that right in committing their crime, and two, because there's like this real fear that if we allow people impacted by incarceration to have their fundamental democratic right, that it would somehow harm society as a whole. So what we're intending to do with this report is, humanize folks, show them that they would be voters just like anybody else who's not impacted by incarceration. And what our research is also revealing is that people who are impacted by incarceration because of the experience of their incarceration are actually more likely to be civically engaged, more likely to be a more thoughtful voter and do more research. So that we're hoping to release that report in January of next year, accompanying our legislation. And we are actually having a big launch event tomorrow evening here in Los Angeles to start sharing some of that data. And in addition to the data from the report, share a video that we produced where we interviewed several people who are currently in prison and on parole, asking again the same types of questions in the survey, what they would vote for if they could, and to really convey the point and show human faces and show that as society, we are actually losing because we have disenfranchised so many folks in California. So the narrative change work that we're doing around the report and the production of this video, in addition to the legislative work and eventually making it to the ballot in 2020, are all part of the long-term strategy that we have to turn California into a state like Maine and Vermont, where people never lose their right to vote because of a felony conviction. So yeah, I'd be happy to answer any questions at the end of this. And if folks are interested in learning more about Initiate Justice or our voting rights restoration work, please do feel free to reach out to me.
Thank you so much, Taina. And last up, we will have Sarah Shannon from the University of Georgia discuss research on felony disenfranchisement.
Right, thank you. This is going to be the nerdy part of the webinar. So hopefully you all have been inspired by the previous speakers and will still be awake by the time I am done speaking. I'm trying to share my screen with you all. Is that working?
Yes, we can see it now.
Wonderful, thank you. So it's really gratifying for me personally to be part of this webinar today and just to be in some way as an academic a participant in this overall effort and movement to increase access to the franchise for people who have felony convictions. And what I'm going to talk about today is a part of a long-term effort, the part of scholars beyond myself that started in the early 2000s with Christopher Eugen and Jeff Manza, really trying to estimate the number of people who are disenfranchised, but also the effects of these policies on individuals as well as on our polity as a whole. So I've joined this effort from about 2010 on. I was a part of forming the estimates for the 2012 report that the Sentencing Project published, as well as the 2016 report that was mentioned earlier. So many thanks, I think, from us, from our whole collaborative team, to Marc and to the Sentencing Project for supporting this effort and for helping us academics make forays into the public and connect with practitioners, policymakers, and the media around this crucial issue. So our most recent estimates, as I mentioned, on this population, the population of people who are disenfranchised, was published by the Sentencing Project in 2016, and the report here titled 6 Million Lost Voters, State Level Estimates of Felony Disenfranchisement 2016. Here we showed that there's an estimated 6.1 million people who are disenfranchised due to felony conviction, and that's up from 5.85 million as of 2010, and going back even further, up from 1.2 million in 1976. So obviously there's been a great deal of growth over time in the disenfranchised population. But I'm also very excited to dig into the new report from the Sentencing Project on the number that have been re-enfranchised. That's been a sticky issue for us in making these estimates, so I'm excited to see what they've found in that report. So for those of you familiar with the report, you've probably seen our table before that shows our state-by-state estimates of the number of people who are disenfranchised. Since we've been hearing a lot about California and Florida, I just want to point out that you can see here that about 1% of the voting age population was disenfranchised in California as of 2016, as compared to 10% in Florida. And that's, of course, driven in no small part by the big differences in policy that the previous speakers have already told you about. So how do we calculate that? I'm going to go under the hood a little bit with our estimates for you all, just to tell you where these numbers come from. How do we calculate that 6.6 million number? So I want to talk through our data sources, which come primarily from Department of Justice publications, our methods, which are demographic life tables, and some challenges and caveats, as well as some future directions. So our data sources, especially in the most recent years, are coming from these publications from the DOJ, particularly through the Bureau of Justice Statistics. And as you can see on the screen, this is an example of a most recent report available on prisoners in 2016 from the BJS. And we take our estimates of the number of people who are released from prison each year from these tables, like the one that you can see on the slide, those last couple of columns, unconditional and conditional releases. And we use those numbers in our annual cohorts to understand how many people are being released from from prison. We use the same similar type tables from other publications on probation and parole, and then we also use historical publications going much further back in time. But it's really the state policies around disenfranchisement that end up dictating what kind of method we need to use to identify the number of people who are disenfranchised. So for example, in California, as well as in states like Arkansas, we can draw these numbers pretty directly from those BJS reports, because it's those states disenfranchise people who are in some way still under correctional supervision. So we don't really have to do any further estimation process. It's only in those states where people are being disenfranchised beyond the completion of their sentence, such as in states like Delaware and Florida. And obviously we've heard a bit about Florida this morning, leading the nation in disenfranchising the highest number of people due to their stringent policies. So for the states where there's disenfranchisement beyond the completion of the sentence, that's where our demographic life tables come into play. And we use this method. It's the same kind of method that demographers use when they're trying to estimate things like marriage rates, fertility rates, death rates. And it's actually a form of survival analysis. So we're trying to identify the number of people each year who are released from prison or who are on felony probation, who have not recidivated and who have not died. And so then we can say that they've survived. They're still there, present in the general population. To compile these estimates, again, we draw those numbers on people released from prison, people entering felony probation, and the number of people that we estimate are in jail for felony convictions. Our estimates use data stretching back to 1948. For the 2016 report, the most recent numbers were available in 2014, so we had to extend out those estimates to 2016 using the trend from 2013 to 2014. But then what we do is we reduce the number each year that are sort of entering this population for recidivism and mortality. And then we also do our best to add back in the number that have been re-enfranchised. And like I said, there are some real data limitations there, and I'm excited about the new report. And again, just to emphasize, we only need to do this method for the states that are disenfranchising people post-sentence. So lifting up the hood here, I hope this isn't freaking anybody out, but this is what it looks like inside our life tables. So I just wanted to give you a very brief example from the state of Alabama, for example. And down in the right-hand corner, you can see here, we're drawing those numbers from the BJS reports of people who are unconditionally and conditionally released from prison in the year 2000. And then through a series of formulas, we apply a recidivism rate, we apply a death rate, and we end up with, in the year 2000, about 5,585 people were disenfranchised because they had been, they were re-entering from prison. And then for each year, we have to annually total up all of the people from previous annual cohorts that we estimate have been to prison, but are still in the community. So they have not yet recidivated, they have not yet died. And that's why when you come to these last couple columns there on the right, you'll see that number of 60,789 for the year 2000. And that's much larger because it is accounting for all of those previous cohorts that have come before them. So as you can see, there are several moving parts to this technique. The good news is that the math that's underlying the life table calculations is not actually that complicated. There are formulas involved, but it involves adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing. So once you understand the logic of the technique, it's really more about, can you find the data that you need in order to perform these kinds of estimates. So that's the bad news, is data quality can really be lacking in this regard, and that's certainly something that we have struggled with in our estimates over time. So the biggest challenge by far are the data and the data quality. So, but the data have generally become better over time in terms of coverage, in terms of the kinds of data that are available, but there can still be some significant gaps. In particular, we often encounter missing data and have to do some interpolation. Some states don't report in some years, and so we have to interpolate there. Definitions can differ by state. That's especially the case around issues of race and ethnicity, maybe even offense type to some extent. So there's really a lack of consistent data on particular subgroups over time, and we're often asked, what about Hispanic, Latino voters? What about people with nonviolent drug felony convictions and those things? And we really have not been able to get at those kinds of estimates nationally because of these data limitations. So just a few other caveats that we always like to include about our estimates is that they are estimates for the states that disenfranchise beyond the serving of the sentence. So they're not head counts. For the states that we can know that snapshot data from the BJS reports because people are currently under some supervision and disenfranchised, that's much more straightforward. But our estimates in states like Florida are just that, they're an estimate. We've applied a national recidivism and death rate calculation in the life table, so these aren't necessarily state specific. And we do know that states vary in rates of recidivism and other factors. And so those are the kinds of things that more refined analyses could be done. And we've done some of that in a broader paper that we wrote on people with felony convictions that was published in the academic journal Demography in 2017. So we did try to put some bounds around these estimates in that table. The other issue is accounting for reenfranchisement, and that's something, again, that we've tried to gather as much data as we can in those states that disenfranchise post-sentence, but those data can be tremendously hard to come by, and so, again, looking forward to what's been discovered by the Sentencing Project. So I guess I'll just conclude with a few words on some future directions. One obvious future direction is to continue to update the state level estimates based on and taking into account these recent legal changes. I'm certainly hoping that by a 2020 report, we might have something exciting to report about Florida and other states. Also, county or city level estimates would be another direction. And here's maybe where some of you all come in your local jurisdictions. I know we often get asked about what about more fine-grained estimates. And again, because of data consistency issues and availability, we haven't been able to do that at the national scale, which has been our focus. But I would be more than happy to try to give good advice to people who want to perhaps try to replicate what we've been doing, but doing it at a more fine-grained level. I think also trying to find more leverage about other subgroups by race and ethnicity, even gender or offense type. We really need some improved data collection here. And it may also be the kind of thing that needs to be done within states or at a more local level where data might be more available. And I think just ongoing research agendas for academics as well as policymakers and activists would be examining the effects of disenfranchisement and reenfranchisement on issues like public safety, civic engagement, how having voted with a felony conviction can lead to another felony conviction. I know that that's something that Chris Eugen has been really involved in and writing about. And there's just so much more that we have left to learn about how this issue impacts not only individuals, but our polity as a whole. And I just, again, want to thank everyone for using our numbers, for making them useful. I think my collaborators and I are committed to continuing to do our part in this effort. I think we're always really heartened when we see our estimates being used in ways to try to increase access to the ballot box. I think this ruling earlier this year by the U.S. District Court in the Northern District of Florida, seeing a judge cite our estimates and ruling Florida's process as unconstitutional was pretty amazing, pretty exciting. And I think, again, we look forward to doing our best to be a resource to all of you and the good work that you're doing all around the country. So thanks again to the Sentencing Project and to you all for listening today.
Thanks, Sarah. We're going to start the Q&A session now. So if everyone wants to share their screens, we can open it up for discussion and start taking questions. We've had some questions already come in during the discussion. And just as a reminder, you can submit your questions to the presenters by using your GoToWebinar panel on the right. So the first thing we'll start with, first question is, for advocates interested in working to end felony disenfranchisement in their state, where should they start? If anyone wants to begin.
Taina, you're a state advocate.
So I think I was lucky a little bit. I think the first thing is that you have the Sentencing Project. By going to their site, then you're able to start seeing what organizations in your particular state have either partnered with the Sentencing Project or have even contributed to some of the data or the research that they're putting on their site. And then I would definitely connect to those organizations that are already plugged in. So in the case of me, I was fortunate because when I joined the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, the Sentencing Project was a part of that coalition. And so I got to hear Nicole Porter and Marc Maurer once a month, every month for quite a number of years, which helped broaden my understanding of the issue and made me a more effective advocate.
I apologize. I had a sound issue, so I didn't hear the question.
It was, where do you suggest people who want to get involved and be an advocate on this issue, where should they start?
In my opinion, in addition to the things that Desmond already said, I think that it's also really important to be in touch with folks who are directly impacted by incarceration. Making sure that you're reaching out to families, that you're reaching out to folks who are currently inside and who have had their voting rights removed because of felony disenfranchisement, and making sure that you're collaborating with folks who, whose lives are changed because of this, and making sure that you're taking leadership from them, in addition to building coalition and conducting the important research and polling and all of the power mapping and fundraising and all of the fun things that come with campaigning. I would just really stress that it's important to make sure that you are working closely with and taking leadership from directly impacted folks.
And this question is also for you, Taina, and Desmond can also join in. What does your research show about the public's knowledge regarding the existence of felony disenfranchisement? Does the public know that certain people with felony convictions can't vote?
Yeah, so our experience in California has been that people are aware and actually think that there are more voter disenfranchisement restrictions than there actually are. So we spoke with many people when we were doing our outreach, where folks were saying that they couldn't sign our petition because they couldn't register to vote because they have a really old conviction, or folks who or maybe on county probation and thinking that they can't vote, but you can vote if you're on probation, just not if you're on parole. When we were doing outreach in front of county jails and collaborating with organizations who were going inside the county jails, folks didn't know that they could vote when they were in jail. So in our experience, most of the miscommunication or misinformation has been around folks thinking that they don't have the right when they actually do. So, in addition to the 162,000 folks who legally are disenfranchised, I wonder how many folks who are peripherally disenfranchised because of this misinformation.
In the case of Florida, so we take on a slightly different perspective, because I think most individuals who've been through the criminal justice system, there's just an automatic assumption that they're not able to vote no matter what state they're in, right? But when I talk to people who cannot vote or may not be impacted, just to get a gauge of their sense of what's going on with felon disenfranchisement, what we found is that the overwhelming majority of the people have been shocked, and they do not know that the current policies in Florida actually exist. And when they hear about it, one of probably the most popular words that come out of their mouth is "that's not right" or "that's not fair," right? And I think that has really contributed to us being able to garner a lot of support for this, because we've actually been able to really just get out and just educate people as to the current system and why it's broken. But I can say that even in spite of the education that we've been able to accomplish, there's still a ton of people in Florida who are still unaware of the system. And some even think that if there is a system there, that it's a good system and it's working properly, and they're unaware that people are waiting years and that there's a backlog and it's so arbitrary. They thought it was some fair system that was already in place that quickly get people through the process.
Let me just add that because of the misinformation, not only among people with felony convictions, but sometimes election officials themselves, there's a real need for the criminal justice system agencies to step up and ensure that people understand their rights, when their rights have been taken away and when their rights can be restored. And unfortunately, there are very few correction systems in the country that do a thorough and ongoing job of notification here. So depending on the policies in a given state, every state should be saying that the day that a person leaves prison or exits parole or probation supervision, whichever is most appropriate, along with other information they get about coming back to the community, they should be required to give information about when voting rights will be restored and how to go about registering to vote and the like. That's not the same as changing the policy itself, but as long as we have disenfranchisement practices, the least we should be doing is educating people about what they are and how you can go about regaining the right to vote in your individual state.
And so to build on that point, Desmond, when Amendment 4 passes in Florida, is there going to be an advocacy campaign to help people understand the new policies and to get people registered to vote?
Florida Rights Restoration Coalition has already taken steps towards that. We have now, I believe, over 13 chapters throughout the state that's led by directly impacted people, led by returning citizens and or individuals, family members of individuals who have been caught up in the criminal justice system. And so, yes, we are gearing up to be able to help spread the word, help people understand what the process is going to be, and walk them through that process, because we know that the quicker we get people signed up and engaged, the more likely they are to remain so civically engaged in upcoming elections, whether they be national or federal elections or local elections where they live.
Right. This question is, does the bipartisan collaboration on criminal justice reform extend to expanding voting rights to people with felony convictions?
Well, let me say it has to some extent so far. In the federal level in Congress, there's been legislation introduced over a good number of years now that would, if passed, would apply to federal elections. State officials, state policymakers govern how state elections are done, but for federal elections, if Congress wants to ensure that essentially we're all playing by the same rules, the legislation says that for federal elections, anyone who's not incarcerated can participate in those votes. Many of the initial proposals were submitted by Democrats. In recent years, people like Republican Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky have been very active, very vocal around these issues as well. So we're seeing more of this happening, certainly around general criminal justice reform, but growing movements, I think, to take on disenfranchisement from both sides of the aisle as well.
Great. The next question asks, is anyone working on the separate but related issue of the ability of those who are currently incarcerated but not actually disenfranchised to allow them to exercise their right to vote?
Well, I can say, one of the real challenging areas has to do with people incarcerated in local jails. There are about 700,000 people in local jails around the country. The vast majority of those people are legally eligible to vote because they're either awaiting trial, haven't been convicted yet, or if they're serving a sentence, it's typically for a misdemeanor, which doesn't result in disenfranchisement. So the numbers, hundreds of thousands of people are legally eligible to vote. It's just a relative handful of jails around the country that establish procedures by which people in jail can get an absentee ballot, can register to vote, and can vote from the jail itself. So there's, in addition to the 6 million who are legally ineligible, we have these hundreds of thousands added on to that as well. Here in the District of Columbia, because of both citizens, grassroots movements, and a cooperative jail staff, there's been voting for individuals in jail for a good number of years now. The City Board of Elections has been very cooperative and sends officials into the jail to aid in the voting process, and that'll be happening in a couple of weeks here before the midterm elections. But as I've said, unfortunately, that's the exception to the rule as far as most jurisdictions go.
Nationally, sorry, Desmond, do you want to say something? No, okay. Nationally, what should the next priority be for reforming voting rights?
Well, let me jump in for a start, others can as well. Much of the attention in this movement has been around the states that disenfranchise post-sentence. Those are the most extreme states. The numbers are tremendously high. And I think it fundamentally strikes most people as unfair that a person has met all the obligations of the sentence and is still disenfranchised. There's growing momentum now to also move the franchise to people on probation or parole supervision in the 34 states where that's prohibits voting, and the argument has been these people are living in the community under all the rules and regulations that they're obligated to abide by, and yet they're still treated as second-class citizens. And the emerging movement now, as we've heard from Taina and others, is to question whether people in prison should be disenfranchised as well. What is the fundamental meaning of punishment for a crime which may involve incarceration, and what is the distinction between citizenship, your rights as a citizen, which in many countries is not affected by a felony conviction.
Mm-hmm. Should advocates be prioritizing a federal bill to restore voting rights to people with felony convictions in federal elections?
Well, again, let me start off. Yeah, we need to do that. The Sentencing Project, we and many allies have been doing that. Of course, we have 50 different policies, 51 when it comes to voting rights for people with felony convictions. So it's really up to all of us to do what we can in respective states and the federal government. There's not more or less important to work at the federal level. I think we see the movement is growing, and there's very encouraging activity around the country, and the change needs to come at every state, basically.
Mm-hmm. This question is asking, how can advocates improve centering impacted individuals in their campaigns and making sure that they're a part of the reform efforts?
Yeah, so in my experience, what's been really helpful is not just, peripherally like involving people in the campaigns, but actually like learning from folks' leadership who are directly impacted. So what it does not look like is, this organization is running this campaign and we're just gonna, tap you for you to share your story, and then you're no longer involved in the campaign. You're not involved in the decision-making processes. You're not helping us develop our strategy and our messaging. Essentially, folks who are impacted need to be at the front, left, right, and center of this work. Myself, I'm a directly impacted person. My husband served 7 years inside, and we got the idea to do this work from one of our organizers who is currently incarcerated, and that is how we consistently move through our work. Most of our membership is currently incarcerated. We have over 7,000 members who are in prison right now, and anytime we move through any policy or move through the strategy around the voting rights work, it always looks like conducting a survey of our members first, ranking what policy priorities are, and then moving forward strategically in that way. And I recognize that many other organizations may not necessarily be structured that way, where that's the way that they organize. So then what you should do in that situation, in my opinion, is tap organizations who are structured that way, work in close collaboration with grassroots organizations who can provide those resources and the leadership of impacted folks.
Thank you, Taina. Well, I'm trying to find some data questions for Shannon. Sarah, is there any, are there lots of questions you get that you would want to address that, something that would improve the data that you collect that you would wish that you had, or anything you want to add about your data collection?
Funding from the federal government to better collect data, starting there. But no, I mean, I think it's in the same ways that some of the movement to restore the vote needs to come from the grassroots. Perhaps to get leverage on some of these issues, we need to start at the local level, where if people know of data that are available or sources of that in their local area, if we can't get a full national county level analysis, maybe that could start happening state by state. And so I'd be glad to hear from people that have ideas about that. And I think maybe it does need to start happening from the bottom up if we're not going to have that happening from on high.
So, yes, so I like to add to that. Sarah, one of our members, Angel Sanchez, amazing story. He's an FRC member, homeless, a returning citizen. Now he's starting his second year law school at the University of Miami. But in his undergraduate, he's also a Jack King Cook scholar. And he did a thesis that studied the levels of disenfranchisement among Latinos. And so his study was able to uncover at least 180,000 Latinos that were impacted in Florida by felon disenfranchisement. And so I do agree with you. I think it starts from the lower level. I think that some of our institutions can be funded to have some of their students do the research. It's going to be hard in states like Florida, where they do make attempts to hide the Latino population within the white population. And so I think that's much needed. It gives us a better idea of exactly who being imprisoned in our county jails as well. And that would, I believe, help us be more effective in criminal justice reform advocacy.
Yeah, totally.
Well, thank you everyone for participating in the webinar call. Thank you to Marc, Taina, Desmond, and Sarah. The two reports that were mentioned today are listed on this slide, and I encourage everyone to go to Initiate Justice website and Florida Rights Restoration Coalition website to see what Taina and Desmond's work is. This webinar will be recorded and posted on our website and YouTube page later this evening, and thank you all again.
Thank you.
Thank you.